2 hours of heavy rain fell before Caleb heard the knock that changed his future. Picture this with me. He just killed his daughter's lamp when that urgent, fateful pounding began. Totally wrong for midnight. He pulled the door open. A lone woman stood on his porch in the driving downpour. One hand pressed firmly against a belly heavy with late-stage pregnancy. Her expensive designer coat completely soaked. She dominated every single business news channel he had ever watched. Tech CEO pioneer, always the calm cover story. But her corporate fame didn't freeze his lungs, it was those eyes. He had recognized those eyes from his past since he was 10. Why did his past return today? After all these years, why was he the only future she wanted to find? The evening had actually started quiet. Caleb arrived home around 7:30 with black grease under his nails and a billed invoice for fixing a warehouse fridge 20 miles up north. 31 years old, he had been grinding at this air conditioning repair since 19. Late plumbing calls. Checking wiring for local neighbors who trusted his bare hands over fancy city workers. Honest labor, modest pay, long shifts, for him that was usually enough. He and his young daughter Sadie shared a faded yellow house just outside a sleepy town. A tiny yard, simple furniture, and a kitchen that always smelled like whatever warm meal he cooked the night before. He knew everyone on the block. The local diner memorized his usual. He had fully accepted the quiet, steady shape of his life. That night, he checked Sadie's spelling words at the kitchen table, finished some old soup, and listened to the storm start. Sadie drifted off, clutching her small stuffed bunny. Caleb paused in her doorway for a second. He felt that deep, heavy love single dads hold in their chests, never quite knowing where to put it all. Then came the loud knock. He just assumed a neighbor. Probably Pastor Luke from down the street. Let's look closely here. He opened the door without the porch light, completely unprepared for the ghost from his past waiting outside. She stood freezing in the rain, shoulders hunched up, wet hair plastered flat against her pale face. The designer coat she had on easily outpriced his pickup truck. One pale hand choked the porch railing, the other rested protectively over her swollen belly. Her pale face was held together in the careful way of someone who faked strength all day and has absolutely zero fight left. Caleb froze dead in the open doorway for 3 long seconds. He knew Eleanor Pierce like an old melody from his past, untouched by 16 long years. Not through slow logic, but through some ancient memory stored deep in the body. The harsh angle of her jaw, her pinched brows when scared, those dark eyes that always guarded way more secrets than they ever willingly shared. She was exactly 30 years old now. She directed a massive medical tech startup that had dominated 3 national magazine covers this year alone. Now this corporate giant was shivering on his porch. We've all seen desperation. She stared like he was the absolute last safe harbor remaining. Caleb. Her tone sounded deeper than he recalled, raspy and barely a quiet whisper. I have nowhere else to go. He didn't even flinch. Right behind him, down the dark hall, came the quiet tapping of small feet. Little Sadie stepped into the hallway light. Little Sadie blinked, one hand trailing the wall. She studied her father, the soaked woman in the doorway, and then the stranger's pregnant belly. Reaching out, she gripped her dad's hand while the storm poured down. Sometimes people from the past arrive right on time to change the future. Tonight was that night. Caleb finally stepped aside, letting her inside. The pregnant CEO's heels clicked twice on the hardwood. Then, she froze. She scanned the cramped living room, eyeing the patchwork throw on the sofa. Sadie's crayon artwork taped up, and a reading lamp with a slightly bent shade. Everything felt well loved, gently used, cared for, and never upgraded just for the sake of appearances. A total contrast to the sterile penthouses she'd inhabited for 10 years. Caleb quietly handed her a dry dish towel. Eleanor's hands shook slightly when she grabbed it. It was the subtle tremor of a woman running purely on willpower, standing right at the edge of a total breakdown. Sadie crossed over to the couch, sitting totally motionless, watching this mysterious stranger with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She was definitely her father's daughter in that regard. Caleb filled the kettle, going through the familiar motions of making tea, moving with the slow caution of a single dad afraid to speak just yet. His heart was racing. Only pure stubbornness kept his hands steady. "Where is your driver?" he asked, back-turned. "Your assistant?" You mean my staff? I left without them, she said. He turned around. She sat perched on the sofa edge, her soaked coat folded over one arm, staring blankly at the floorboards. On the TV screen, a breaking news headline scrolled past. Speculation about Pierce Biotech board drama, unnamed sources, and mounting internal pressure. Caleb glanced at the screen. Then he looked back at her. You and I both know whatever dragged her here tonight was far from simple. Unprompted, little Sadie hopped up and walked over to the hall closet. She returned holding a thin, soft blanket. She draped it over Eleanor's knees with the extreme seriousness of a child doing crucial work. Eleanor stared down at the little girl. Her expression totally softened. Gone was the fake diplomatic warmth she used at press conferences. This was real and completely unguarded, like a door left wide open by accident. Thank you, she whispered quietly. Sadie nodded once, climbing back to her corner of the couch as Caleb brought the tea. Setting the warm mug down, he suddenly spotted a detail he hadn't seen in 16 long years. Right on Eleanor's left wrist, half hidden beneath her soaked blouse cuff, rested a braided blue thread bracelet, totally faded now and fraying at the knot. He made that for her when they were 12, hand-braided from cheap twine right inside his dad's old workshop. She had solemnly held out her wrist that day, letting him tie it in place. He had spent 16 whole years desperately trying to erase her from his mind. Yet she kept it. Let's be honest, how is a guy supposed to process that? Certain childhood summers carry a magic that simply cannot be explained to anyone who wasn't actually there to see it. Caleb Harper lived through one of those legendary summers. We've all been there. After age 10, every summer just feels a little less vivid. You and I know how fate works. Every June, Eleanor arrived at Millbrook Road. One suitcase and the rigid posture of a girl raised to impress. But on Millbrook Road, there was never anyone she needed to impress. There was only thick summer heat, tall grass, a creaking tire swing, and Caleb, the carpenter's son who belonged to her history, already memorizing every local shortcut. They became fast friends the way lonely children do, with nothing else to do but exist together. First by simple proximity, then by undeniable recognition. Eleanor was sharper than anyone he knew. She only argued about things that truly mattered. She laughed out loud when something was genuinely funny. And she saw Caleb with a profound clarity that nobody else in that tired town had ever bothered to use. You know much more than you let on, she told him one afternoon. Up in a maple tree, she said, you just don't want people to know. He had no real answer. He just shrugged, feeling completely and entirely found out. They built small things from scrap wood. They read worn paperbacks on the back porch whenever the summer heat made moving pointless. They raced bikes down the steep hill on Crescent Street, dragging them laboriously back up. They kept a running argument over which books were worth finishing and which ones deserved to be tossed aside. And that friendly argument was one of the greatest pleasures of those childhood summers. The twine bracelet had been Caleb's idea. He spent an afternoon in his father's workshop, braiding blue twine around a bent nail just to get the tension right. He unraveled it 3 separate times before getting it perfectly even. He gave it to Eleanor with the fake, casual indifference of a 12-year-old boy who hasn't learned how to admit that something actually matters to him, and she offered her wrist with a quiet solemnity that was absolutely the perfect response. Under that maple tree, they made a promise, the kind children make with total sincerity. That distance or money could never change what they knew about each other. But timelines fracture. The summer Caleb turned 14, Eleanor vanished. He waited 2 full weeks before letting himself feel the loss. When he did, the heartbreak was far worse than expected. He wrote her a letter, getting her address from a grandmother who handed it over carefully. He wrote 3 more letters over the following months. No reply ever came. Eventually, he stopped writing. He began the slow, grim work of teaching himself to expect less. Now a single father, he wanted very little. He had learned that survival skill thoroughly. He looked at the pregnant CEO across his kitchen table, noticing the tired lines near her eyes. He stared at the faded bracelet on her wrist and felt his reality suddenly shift. She hadn't stayed away by choice. He didn't know why he suddenly believed it, only that he absolutely did. I wrote to you, she said, once Sadie was in bed and the storm hammered down. After I left so many letters, Caleb went still. I never received a thing, he said. I know. Her jaw tightened. "I figured that out later," he set his mug down slowly. The air in the kitchen shifted entirely. "How much later?" She looked down at the table. "Years, way too many. You see how the past changes the future?" The timeline he carried since 14 completely shattered. He'd spent a lifetime being quietly angry at her, locked in the silent resentment of a man who never shouts. He never entirely stopped waiting. Now, the past stood in his kitchen, wearing a bracelet she should have tossed a full decade ago, telling him about missing letters. The truth finally spilled out in fragments. You know how it is. Secrets crack under heavy pressure when buried for too long. Eleanor explained her company was being stolen entirely from the inside. Dominic Vale, her vice president, and the one man she blindly trusted as a partner. He spent months quietly building a trap, sending fake emails in her name behind her back. Forged legal documents circulated with signatures she never authorized. He groomed the board to steal her CEO title without any of her consent. Dominic was also the father of her unborn baby. She stated this coldly with zero drama. Like a woman delivering cold facts she had forcibly untangled from her own deep heartbreak. She really thought he was on her side. Believed it for almost 2 years. Through endless late shifts and a slow buildup of what she wrongly thought was a shared vision. She was completely dead wrong. Right before a massive corporate buyout, he weaponized her vulnerable pregnancy against her, telling the board that a single pregnant founder was just too risky. He even told her mother a quiet little wedding would fix the mess neatly. Her mother nodded along. Eleanor viciously fought back. They had a blowout fight that burned every single bridge down. She drove aimlessly for 2 rainy hours, pulled off the highway, wondering where a ruined CEO could actually hide. Not a fancy hotel, Dominic would track her down in 60 minutes. Not a friend's place. Everyone she knew lived in his wealthy orbit. But fate has perfect timing. She thought of Caleb, someone she hadn't considered in years. But his face surfaced in her mind anyway. A steady, simple force from a time way before reason. "You were the absolute only person I could turn to," she whispered, "someone entirely cut off from that corporate life. The only guy who wouldn't try to manage it, who wouldn't put company profits way above my own basic survival." Caleb just stood there, silent for a long moment. Then came the collision. He finally asked the heavy question burning inside him since she knocked. "After all these years," he asked, "why remember me now, just when everything falls apart?" The single dad didn't yell. He never did, but the pure silence of his question carried a crushing emotional weight. He explained exactly what waiting for her had felt like. No theatrics, no pity-seeking, just cold facts like a man talking about the rain. The weeks hoping for a letter, the months inventing empty excuses for her total silence. Then the brutal, grinding effort of shutting down his own heart just to survive the searing pain. 14, then 15, then 16. Over the years he trained himself to view her as a permanently locked door. And that was simply that. Eleanor listened hard, no excuses, no premature apologies. Once he finally finished, she revealed the missing pieces. Years ago, her mother had secretly intercepted his missing letters. Margaret Pierce made a brutally efficient choice then. She decided a poor boy didn't belong in her future, but you and I know the past always comes back. Back then, every letter Eleanor mailed from boarding school was secretly intercepted. She was 17 when she found out. She found Caleb's unread letters stashed in her mother's desk by pure accident. Old enough to feel totally shattered, yet far too young to know how to fight back. We all make tragic assumptions, don't we? Once she gained independence, she believed he had moved on, convincing herself she had no right to alter his future. Back in the present, she stopped talking. Caleb just stared silently at his rough hands. His gaze dropped to that faded bracelet on her wrist. For 16 long years, he took her crushing silence as abandonment. But that cruel silence had actually belonged to her mother all along. Suddenly, Eleanor, who masked her stress with the exact same composure she used as a CEO, faltered. She pressed a palm to her pregnant belly, freezing with a sudden, deeply unnatural stillness. Her breathing hitched. Her entire expression shifted completely. Caleb bolted from his chair before his brain even processed the protective instinct. Over the phone, the family doctor's tone was incredibly careful. Not actual labor, just severe stress contractions, but her blood pressure was dangerously high and she hadn't slept in 3 days. She desperately needed real rest, so Caleb quickly prepared his quiet guest bedroom. Little Sadie suddenly appeared in her pajamas, offering up her beloved stuffed rabbit with outstretched arms. "She can hold Chester," Sadie whispered, "so she isn't scared anymore." Eleanor gently accepted the toy rabbit with both hands. A lump caught in her throat. You know those haunted hours before dawn? Waking from an unwanted nightmare, this runaway CEO soon found herself pacing the shadows of his dark kitchen. Caleb was already awake at the table, sitting with a water glass and unopened mail. He wasn't reading, just staring blankly, the exact way people sit when sleep absolutely refuses to come. Without saying a single word, he stood up and poured her some cool water. She sat directly across from him. They shared those fragile whispers that 2 a.m. naturally permits, discussing Sadie's fierce stubbornness about bedtime. And those early pregnancy months, when faking a perfectly normal life still felt highly possible. Her eyes wandered over Sadie's messy drawings on the fridge and his chipped mug, worn comfortable by daily use. She absorbed the deep, quiet warmth of a sturdy house built around one genuinely loved child. "You became exactly the man I always knew you'd be," she murmured, mostly to herself. He met her gaze. "I'm just a repairman," he replied gently, "in a tiny town." "Yes," she answered softly, meaning it as the highest possible compliment. Suddenly, her cell phone buzzed on the counter, flashing its bright warning over and over again. She tilted the glowing screen inward, and Caleb watched her delicate features instantly turn guarded. Placing it face down, she exhaled sharply. "He knows I'm hiding here." Come 9 a.m. the next morning, 3 sleek SUVs with city plates idled near the local church. Caleb's neighbor knocked on the back fence to point them out. A sharp-looking stranger was already asking dangerous questions down the adjacent street. Gripping cold tea by the kitchen window, Eleanor finally told Caleb she had to run away. She spoke softly, sounding like a defeated executive who had run the grim numbers and accepted a totally unavoidable, heartbreaking conclusion. "If I stay here, you get dragged into this disaster," she sighed. "That is completely unfair." "If you leave pregnant and exhausted," Caleb warned, "he scoops you up in 10 minutes flat." "I know that, but you absolutely cannot fight off an attack while protecting a moving target." Caleb held her gaze, completely unfazed. "This changes the future. He isn't walking up my driveway giving orders. That is never going to happen. You and I are watching the past rewrite tomorrow." She stared, so used to battling alone that any ally felt like a trap. Right then, 72-year-old Pastor Luke Bennett knocked softly at the back door. A weathered face, eyes that had witnessed the history of this entire town unfold. He had noticed the cars. He showed up because he knew the ghosts in this house. He warned them that Margaret Pierce was already heading there. 2 hours away, driving north. Then, right before leaving, he dropped a sentence that froze time entirely. "There is a tin box hidden in the church storage room," he confessed. Staring straight at Caleb, he added that he had held on to it for years. He never knew the right time. He paused, saying that moment was finally now. Caleb just stared. Unopened letters, the old pastor quietly revealed. Later that afternoon, Caleb's phone buzzed, a city number calling. The voice was terrifyingly calm, the kind of person who uses a polite tone like a blade. Dominic Vale thanked Caleb for his help, claiming Eleanor acted crazy when stressed out. He suggested they handle the entire situation quietly, like rational adults. Caleb listened in total silence, then hung up without speaking. He lingered in the hall, grabbed his jacket, and went to meet his past. The back room of the church smelled like dry pine and dusty history. A small metal box waiting there. "Let's look inside together." Under the rusted hinge, 11 envelopes. Eleanor's careful writing on each. Those looping cursive letters from a young girl who cared about perfect handwriting. Sent to Caleb Harper, Millbrook Road, never once opened, never once delivered. Pastor Luke gently explained he discovered them years ago, deeply suspecting that Margaret had buried their shared history on purpose. But he lacked proof to interfere. He kept them. Throwing them out felt like finishing the cruel betrayal someone else began. Caleb slumped on a dusty crate, reading 11 desperate letters from a 14-year-old girl. She wrote about vanishing without knowing why. About crying into her pillow that first night, hiding tears from the world. About fighting the terrible thought that he had moved on, and failing completely. About quitting after the 6th letter, only to write 4 more anyway. The final letter ended with one sentence. No matter how far I travel or how long this takes, the summer you knew me is my truest self. He sat there for a long while. Pale sunlight drifted across the storage room as heavy clouds rolled over the small town. He had used her long absence to prove a point that he was completely naive to trust anyone. Naive to believe their promise under the maple tree. Naive to think their old bond was strong enough to survive. He had built his life around that pain. In many ways, he became the man that specific betrayal shaped, distant and careful. Closed off, great at protecting others, but terrible at needing anything for himself. The pain was absolutely real, but the story he believed was entirely wrong. You see how destiny works? When he returned, Eleanor sat with Sadie, coloring a blue crayon drawing. They never heard him enter. He stood there watching his past rewrite his entire future. We see the little girl bent over her drawing, the woman beside her pointing, finally smiling. 16 years of distance vanished. The past had finally arrived, resting right there in his hands. He quietly placed the old tin box on the table. Eleanor just stared at it. Her eyes understood the truth before she spoke. I know I wasn't there, she whispered, even if I had no real choice. I know what it cost you. I know you know, he replied softly. Sadie dropped her crayon, watching these two people with the careful patience of a child. Caleb held the pregnant executive's gaze for a long time. If they hadn't isolated you at 14, he asked slowly, would you still be running? She stayed quiet. No, probably not, he nodded. Then let's make sure it stops right here. The corporate sharks arrived Thursday morning, wearing a thin fake mask of civil concern. You and I know this type. Dominic exited the lead car wearing an obscenely expensive coat. His corporate lawyer immediately shadowed his shoulder. Two muscle men lingered right at the property line, never quite stepping onto the grass. Standing exactly how hired muscle stands, trained to be perfectly visible and quietly threatening. Margaret Pierce pulled up separately. Her smaller car somehow radiated an even heavier, colder authority. She stared at the single father's porch like it was just another messy logistical problem. Caleb planted himself firmly on those steps. Arms completely relaxed, his face holding the absolute stillness of a man from the past who has fully decided how to protect her future. Dominic confidently strolled up that concrete path, flashing a completely hollow smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke smoothly of worry and delays, of the absolute need to get back to the city for everyone's sake. He treated Caleb like a footnote, just some minor blue-collar roadblock to easily maneuver around. Margaret stepped up, offering fake gratitude for the hospitality before insisting that family business stays strictly between real family. She came to me, Caleb stated flatly, that was it. Dominic started lecturing about legal threats and corporate startup stability. Eleanor's heavy duties, the complications of the pregnancy. We all know the tactic. He threatened a massive PR scandal if she didn't quietly surrender. Then the rusty screen door creaked open. Eleanor finally emerged. She had changed her clothes. She stood incredibly tall. Deep exhaustion still painted her face, but that old, unbreakable strength had returned to her posture. She stared straight at Dominic. She glanced at her mother, finally unleashing the heavy truth she had spent 3 agonizing days finding the courage to speak. No dramatic flair, no performing for the crowd, just plainly spoken like a leader stating cold facts she was totally done fearing. She had never once agreed to marry him. She would legally contest every single business document they had forced her to sign under coercion. She specifically called out 3 corrupt board members and exposed their exact private emails with Dominic about the hostile takeover to steal her leadership. Her baby would be raised by a mother who chose the truth. She refused to ever apologize for that. Dominic frantically started sputtering about legal consequences. He detailed how a nasty public lawsuit would utterly destroy a tech company already under heavy scrutiny. You see his angle? He weaponized the optics of a pregnant CEO hiding out in a gritty working-class neighborhood. You and I know the type, giving advice with zero authority. He delivered his threats with the slick, calculated precision of a guy who built his career warning people exactly what they might lose. Then he turned to Caleb. He suggested that a single father in his position should think very carefully about which side of this mess he stood on. Caleb just stared him down. I'm going to ask you to leave my property, he stated. The screen door swung open again. Sadie stepped out in her school outfit. It looked a bit too formal, since she had dressed with total seriousness. She stood right by her dad. She glared at the guy in the fancy coat, speaking in that sharp, ringing tone of a 7-year-old who hasn't learned how to hide her feelings yet. If all these grown-ups are making her scared, can she just stay here with us instead? Dead silence. Dominic didn't say a word. Margaret Pierce stared at her pregnant daughter. A complex emotion flashed across her face, totally impossible to define. Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears. She held her ground. She spoke to the whole group. "I'll be at the board meeting Monday, with documentation, my lawyers, and whatever else I need. But I am not going back today as the quiet puppet you all decided I should be." She exhaled. "I'm going back as myself." Dominic walked away. His guys followed. Margaret Pierce stayed behind on the path. She watched her daughter with a look that felt like something human for once, not just another tactic. Then she climbed into her car and drove off. The whole yard fell silent. Sadie quietly slipped her small hand into Caleb's. Watch the past change the future. 5 days left. Eleanor had the proof. What she really needed was the right way to present it. A solid strategy that those arrogant executives couldn't just brush off and ignore. Caleb wasn't a corporate attorney himself, but he had a connection. Ruth Caldwell grew up locally, ran a small corporate dispute firm, and she picked up Caleb's call on the very first ring. She showed up that night, sitting at the kitchen table with Eleanor for 3 solid hours reviewing every file. The leaked emails, the unsigned board votes, the hidden messages between Dominic and his 3 corrupted board members. Ruth broke it down in the blunt, practical terms of an expert who's seen this exact setup before, and knows exactly which piece to pull to dismantle it. By the time Ruth left at 10, they had a real plan and a thick stack of copies. Afterward, Eleanor just sat in the quiet room, staring into space. Caleb sat right across from her. "You're going to be all right," he promised. "How do you know that?" "Because you've survived much worse than this," he said. "You just didn't have your past to build a future on. You and I see it happening." They stayed up past midnight, not discussing strategy, but letting their shared past finally reshape their future. He admitted just how angry her long absence had made him. How he had completely stopped letting himself want anything real. Pouring his entire soul into Sadie, his job, and the strict routine of a single father who absolutely refused to risk again. She confessed that all her past achievements had always felt like a tiny room trapped inside a cage somebody else built. Looking back, she saw how she'd called that feeling ambition, spending 10 years mistaking sheer control for actual freedom. They didn't rush things, yet the unspoken bond between them anchored their shared future perfectly. Little Sadie stood there in her pajamas. "Are you coming back after?" she asked Eleanor softly. "After all the city stuff?" Eleanor just studied the child. She refused to deflect or offer any promise she couldn't actually guarantee. "I want to," she replied. "I'm going to try to become someone worth coming back to." Sadie found that answer completely satisfactory and returned to bed. Caleb met Eleanor's eyes across the table. "I'm driving you Monday," he stated. "Sadie stays with Ruth. I'll get you there." She just stared at him for a while. "You already decided," she whispered. "Yes," he replied. They left at 6 in the morning. The sleepy town remained completely gray as their old truck finally pulled away. Eleanor sat perfectly still, hands resting quietly in her lap, watching the past fade as the open highway revealed her new future. She gently rested one hand on her stomach. The unborn baby made a slow, rolling shift she no longer jumped at but always felt deeply. She studied Caleb's profile while he drove, admiring his steady, unhurried focus on the road. "I'm not scared," she admitted, her tone carrying a quiet note of genuine self-discovery. He briefly glanced over. "Of the big corporate meeting? Of any of it?" "Today," she murmured. He simply nodded, eyes fixed back on the road. The massive boardroom took up an entire floor of "You and I know the type." A towering building where expensive silence acts as a weapon. Eleanor had stood inside that exact room dozens of times. Transformed by her past, she had never walked in like she did that Monday morning. Caleb, however, did not go inside. He sat on a lobby bench beside a potted plant, his jacket folded neatly on his knee. Phone tucked away, radiating the quiet stillness of a man who finally found where he belongs. Not pretending, just fully present, steadily load-bearing. Eleanor marched in right at 9 o'clock, Ruth flanking her side, a crucial folder in hand. Dominic was already sitting down. 3 board members held the tense posture of executives debating how much they actually knew. 2 others, the ones she had secretly briefed over the weekend, watched the entrance with focused readiness. She calmly sat down. She did not smile. She didn't fake any forced composure. She just opened the file. She presented the damning email chain between Dominic and Gerald Marsh, where managing the liability referred explicitly to her unexpected pregnancy. She then displayed the circulated contract amendment. Ruth had officially documented its signatures as being completely legally insufficient. She revealed 4 solid months of Dominic's internal corporate communications, his exact words. His own messages painting the pathetic story of a man claiming an empire that was never his. Dominic only spoke twice. Both times, Eleanor simply replied by sliding the next devastating document forward. By 11 o'clock, the energy shifted. By 11:30, Gerald Marsh practically begged to see Ruth privately. By noon, a panicked Dominic was urgently whispering with his own attorney. An attorney who arrived totally unaware that their entire future had just been fundamentally rewritten. It wasn't some loud, dramatic collapse. You and I know that quiet collapse. It happens when futures are built on false foundations, until someone from the past arrives to rewrite the future. Eleanor pushed through those lobby doors at 1 in the afternoon. Caleb stood up. He read her face, asking nothing. She just said, "It is done." He studied her closely, not for the CEO facade but for the real woman underneath. She was completely and utterly spent. Her iron will was gone. Only a deep weariness remained, the profound exhaustion of someone who has finally accomplished something entirely real. He stepped forward, and she leaned her entire weight briefly against his shoulder. He started to say something meaningful. She gasped his name at a sharp pitch. Labor had begun. The hospital was 7 minutes away. They drove it in 5. Caleb sat waiting, hands gripped between his knees, lost in that heavy, featureless time that hospitals somehow create out of every passing minute. Endless stretches of time, completely empty of detail. He thought about 11 letters in a tin box, a faded twine bracelet, a 7-year-old child asking if the sudden woman at the door could stay. He wrestled with the hard fact that for 16 years he built his life on a false belief, while his true past waited patiently in a church storage room to alter his future. Patient as old paper. He would need far more than a cheap waiting room chair to process this. But that cold, heavily guarded, self-protective armor living in his chest since he was 14, it stopped feeling like a fixed part of him. Clara arrived at 4:52 that afternoon, 6 pounds 14 ounces. She announced her arrival loudly right away, which the nurses called a great sign. Dominic Vale's forced exit from Pierce Biotech's leadership wrapped up within 3 weeks. His lawyer reviewed the damning evidence and firmly advised against fighting the takeover. He kept a tiny equity stake and vanished from Eleanor's life, acting with the swift efficiency of a man left with 0 options. Margaret Pierce did not disappear. She wasn't that kind of woman. But she drove away from Millbrook Road in a week-long silence. When she finally dialed her daughter's number, she dropped the usual strategy. Instead, she asked, "How are you feeling? How much does the baby weigh? Can I visit when you are ready?" Eleanor just said yes. A quiet yes. It sparked a new arrangement, breaking the cold dynamic they had always known. At 30 years old, Eleanor held no naive illusions that her mother would completely change. But she had watched something soften in Margaret's face when a child's honest question froze the room. She chose to believe that subtle shift was real. You and I know how the past calls us back. 6 autumn weeks later, Eleanor returned to that yellow house. She drove herself there. Clara in the back, a 3-day bag, 0 security, no publicist, just an empty schedule ahead. She parked on the quiet street, sitting for a moment with hands resting in her lap. The home looked exactly as it did that first stormy night she arrived. The porch light shining even in the afternoon. A neatly raked yard, fresh crayon drawings taped up. The front door opened. Caleb stepped onto the porch. He watched her car, then the woman from his past standing right there. Then he watched her gently lift the newborn from the back seat. You and I know that look. It is the face of a man whose waiting has finally ended. The face of a guy denying he was waiting, right until the future arrives. His young daughter Sadie burst through the door behind him, chattering away, already fascinated by the newborn. She moved through the world with the bright, trusting confidence of a kid who expects pure joy. The former executive stood there cradling Clara, gazing up at Caleb on his porch steps. "I really have no idea how fast or slow this should go," she said. "I truly do not know how to promise things from such a distance yet. But I know I am completely done living like I am always ready to run away." She paused. "I want to rebuild our future on the truth, if that is still possible." Caleb slowly walked down the steps. He stood before her, studying the face he had known deeply since she was just 10 years old. A face that anchored his past and lived inside his heart, even through all those years of total silence. He glanced at the sleeping infant, beautifully oblivious to how this quiet reunion was rewriting their entire future. "There is nobody left to intercept us anymore," he said. He said it so quietly, stating it like a heavy truth about their shared reality, which it absolutely was. "Nobody left to hide old letters. Nobody to cut our thread, so stay," he said. Sadie stood beside Eleanor, watching the baby with that serious respect she only gave to things she knew would change everything. Golden afternoon sunlight stretched long and warm across the lawn. The old maple tree by the property line glowed brightly. Down the block, a heavy door clicked shut, just the familiar, grounding sound of a neighbor coming back home. The town hummed with normal noise around them, completely indifferent. Safe and unhurried, just like it always was and always will be. Think about it with me. That door opening in the rain for a desperate woman running away had not, in the end, just been a door of simple rescue. It was always something far older and more deeply necessary. It was pure recognition, the kind where the past catches up, requiring both people to step forward together. A path that leads not merely to safety from harm, but to the safety of something deeply real, a shared history, finally returning right on time to change tomorrow. They stepped inside together,